June 6, 1944, the largest amphibious invasion in history. We've all seen the images and heard the stories of unparalleled heroism on the beaches of Normandy. The official narrative is etched into our collective memory. Thousands of brave young men charging ashore into a hail of German machine gun fire, scaling cliffs under a storm of steel, and through sheer grit, carving out a foothold in fortress Europe. It's a story of courage, of overwhelming force, and of a meticulously executed plan that changed the course of World War II. This is the story we see in movies, the one we read in textbooks. But what if I told you the key to this victory wasn't just courage? What if it was a lie? A massive, intricate deception involving a ghost army, inflatable tanks, and fake radio signals that tricked the entire German high command. The story of D-Day you think you know is only half the truth. Today, we're exposing the rest. The official history of D-Day is a powerful and inspiring tale, but it's also one that's full of shocking omissions, strategic blunders, and stubborn myths that have been repeated for decades. The reality of June 6th is far more complex, more chaotic, and frankly, more fascinating than the simplified version we've all been taught. So we're going to peel back the layers of that official story to reveal the truth about the strategic gambles that paid off, the real casualty numbers that are so often misquoted, and the fatal weaknesses of an enemy that was nowhere near as invincible as you might think. This isn't just about busting myths. It's about understanding what really happened and why, against all odds, it actually succeeded. The first and biggest truth that history books often gloss over is that D-Day's success wasn't just guaranteed by force of arms. A huge part of the victory was decided weeks and months before the first soldier ever set foot on a Normandy beach. It all depended on one of the most audacious and elaborate deception campaigns in history, Operation Fortitude. Imagine you're a German intelligence analyst in the spring of 1944. Your job is to predict where the inevitable Allied invasion will land. All logic points to one place, the Pas de Calais. It's the shortest route across the English Channel, just over 20 miles, offering the quickest path for supplies and reinforcements. It's so logical, so obvious, that it had to be the target. The Allied planners knew the Germans were thinking this, so they decided not just to let them believe it, but to actively convince them of it.
And this is where the story gets into spies, illusion, and Hollywood-style special effects. The Allies created a completely fictitious army, the 1st U.S. Army Group, or FUSAG. This wasn't just an army on paper, it had a physical presence. Across the fields of southeast England, directly opposite Calais, an army began to assemble. From the air, German reconnaissance planes saw rows upon rows of Sherman tanks, vast fields of artillery, and sprawling camps for tens of thousands of soldiers. But it was all a mirage. The tanks were inflatable rubber. The landing craft bobbing in the harbors were flimsy creations of wood and fabric. Set designers and camouflage experts were brought in to create the illusion of a massive military buildup, even creating fake tracks in the dirt to simulate the movement of vehicles that didn't exist. To make this phantom army totally convincing, it needed a commander, a leader so feared and respected by the Germans that his presence would be an undeniable signal. They chose General George S. Patton. At the time, Patton was in the doghouse with Allied high command for slapping a soldier, but the Germans saw him as the Allies' best general. His appointment to lead FUSAG was deliberately leaked, and he was seen traveling all over southeast England, lending his celebrity and fearsome reputation to the Ghost Army. But the visual deception was only one part of the ruse. Operation Fortitude also involved a sophisticated electronic war. A dedicated team of radio operators generated a constant stream of fake radio traffic, mimicking the chatter of a real army preparing for invasion. They sent bogus messages, creating the illusion of troop movements and preparations that were happening only in their scripts. The final, crucial piece of this deception came from a network of double agents. British intelligence, MI5, had successfully captured or turned nearly every German agent in Britain under the double-cross system. The most important was a Spanish double agent named Juan Pujol Garcia, codenamed Garbo by the British. The Germans trusted him so completely, they believed he was running a network of over 24 spies across Britain. Of course, this network was entirely fictional. He fed his German handlers a carefully curated mix of true but useless information and critically important lies. His most important lie was confirming that the main Allied invasion force was in fact massing in southeast England to strike at the Pas de Calais. The Germans were so impressed with Garbo's work, they awarded him the Iron Cross for his services, even as he was actively ensuring their destruction.
The result of this grand deception was a strategic blunder of catastrophic proportions. The Germans bought it completely. When the first reports of landings in Normandy came in on June 6th, the German High Command was convinced it was just a feint, a diversion designed to draw their best troops away from the real invasion at Calais. Hitler himself, who was famously asleep when the invasion began, refused to release the powerful panzer divisions held in reserve. He was certain that Patton's Ghost Army was about to launch the main assault. Because of Operation Fortitude, the formidable German 15th Army, one of their most powerful forces, sat in the Pas de Calais for weeks, waiting for an invasion that would never come. Those elite troops and powerful tanks could have been on the Normandy beaches in hours, potentially overwhelming the Allied beachheads. Instead, they were strategically neutralized by an army of rubber and a chorus of lies. The plan for D-Day wasn't perfect, but it had a secret weapon that history books rarely give enough credit to: a masterful, war-winning lie. When we picture D-Day, especially Omaha Beach, the image that comes to mind is often one of near total slaughter, thanks in large part to the opening scene of Saving Private Ryan. The popular belief is that casualties were astronomical, a horrifying bloodbath where tens of thousands died on the sand in a single day. The phrase 10,000 dead is often thrown around. But that's not the whole story. While the fighting on D-Day was undeniably brutal, the actual numbers are more nuanced than the myths suggest, and understanding them is crucial. Let's be clear, the losses were horrific, but the figure of 10,000 dead on D-Day is incorrect. The most reliable estimates place the total number of Allied casualties, which includes killed, wounded, and missing, at just over 10,000 for June 6th. Of that number, the total confirmed Allied dead was approximately 4,414. These losses weren't spread evenly. The American forces bore a significant portion. On Utah Beach, the landings went surprisingly well, with only 197 casualties. Omaha Beach, however, was a different story. Thanks to failed pre-invasion bombardment and the unexpected presence of a veteran German division, the Americans at Omaha faced a wall of fire. They suffered approximately 2,400 casualties on Omaha alone. Adding the airborne divisions dropped behind enemy lines, the total number of American dead on D-Day was 2,501. The British and Canadian forces on Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches also faced fierce resistance. The British suffered around 3,000 casualties across their sectors, with 1,449 killed. The Canadians, landing at Juno Beach, faced heavily fortified positions and rough seas. They sustained just over 1,000 casualties, including 340 killed. These numbers represent a terrible price, but they are a far cry from the myth of tens of thousands killed on the beaches. Perhaps the most surprising part of this is that the casualty figures, as horrific as they were actually lower than what the Allied planners had anticipated. General Eisenhower and his staff were preparing for a bloodbath, with some estimates predicting casualties as high as 75% in the first waves. The fact that the total number of killed, wounded, and missing was around 10,000 out of over 156,000 men who landed was, from a grim military perspective, considered a success. So why does the myth of astronomical casualties persist? Part of it is the sheer shock of the fighting, particularly at Omaha. Personal accounts understandably focused on the brutal reality of the assault, shaping our collective memory. The other reason is context. D-Day was only the beginning of the Battle of Normandy, a brutal 3-month campaign. The fighting in the dense hedgerows, the battles for key cities like Caen, and the final breakout produced staggering casualties that dwarfed those of the initial landings. During the entire Normandy campaign, from June to August 1944, the Allies suffered over 226,000 casualties. The Germans lost an estimated 240,000, with another 200,000 taken prisoner. When people think of the immense cost of Normandy, they often compress the losses of the entire campaign into that single day. The fighting on D-Day was terrible and costly, but the true, prolonged bloodletting came in the weeks that followed. Popular culture has created a powerful image of the German defenders on D-Day, an elite, monolithic force of battle-hardened fanatics manning an impenetrable Atlantic wall. The reality was far different. The German army in Normandy in June 1944 was a patchwork force, a shadow of its former self, plagued by confusion and critical shortages. First, let's talk about the famous Atlantic Wall. It was more of a propaganda masterpiece than an actual fortress. While key ports like Calais were heavily fortified, the long stretches of coastline in between, including Normandy, were inconsistent and often undermanned. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, tasked with improving the defenses, was horrified by what he found. He started a crash program to lay millions of mines and build thousands of obstacles, but it was too little, too late. The wall was a thin crust, not a deep defense. The quality of the troops was also highly variable. While there were some experienced units, many divisions defending the coast were static infantry divisions. These weren't the prime fighting forces of the Wehrmacht. They were often composed of men considered unfit for the Eastern Front, older soldiers, some in their late 30s and 40s, and very young, inexperienced recruits. Even more significantly, a large portion of the defenders weren't even German. They were so-called Osttruppen, conscripts from occupied territories in the East, like Poland and Russia. These men had been pressed into service, and their loyalty was, to put it mildly, questionable. Poorly equipped, many were quick to surrender. The presence of the battle-hardened 352nd Infantry Division at Omaha Beach was the exception, not the rule. And it just goes to show what a difference a single, determined unit could make. So where were Germany's elite forces, the feared SS Panzer divisions? They were held in reserve, far from the beaches, thanks directly to Operation Fortitude and a hopelessly paralyzed command structure. Rommel argued passionately that the panzers needed to be close to the coast. He knew Allied air superiority meant German tanks couldn't move during the day without being destroyed. He believed the invasion had to be defeated on the beaches in the first 24 hours. His superior, Field Marshal von Rundstedt, disagreed, favoring a traditional approach of holding the panzers back for a massive counterattack. Trapped between them was Adolf Hitler, who opted for a disastrous compromise. He gave Rommel control of some divisions, but placed the most powerful reserve panzer units under his own direct control. This meant that on the morning of June 6th, commanders on the ground were forbidden from deploying their most crucial reserves without Hitler's personal permission. And as we know, Hitler was asleep. When he finally woke up late in the morning, he still refused to believe Normandy was the main effort and withheld the panzers for several more critical hours. By the time the armored divisions were finally committed, it was too late. They were fed into the fight piecemeal, under constant attack from Allied fighter bombers. The German war machine on D-Day wasn't a well-oiled machine. It was a rusty, disjointed engine sputtering towards its final breakdown. If you're finding this look behind the official story of D-Day interesting and you want more historical myth-busting, take a moment to subscribe and click the bell icon. We've got a lot more history to uncover, and you won't want to miss it. In a lot of popular culture, especially American-made films, D-Day is often framed as a primarily American achievement. The focus is overwhelmingly on the brutal struggle at Omaha Beach and the daring airborne drops. While the heroism of American forces was absolutely critical, this narrow focus obscures a fundamental truth. D-Day was a colossal international effort. At the very top, the Allied command was a model of coalition leadership. Led by the American General Eisenhower, its key leaders were British, including Deputy Supreme Commander Arthur Tedder and Naval Commander-in-Chief Bertram Ramsay. Let's look at the naval forces. Of the nearly 7,000 vessels in the invasion armada, the overwhelming majority were provided by Britain's Royal Navy, around 80% of the warships and landing craft. The fleet also included ships from Canada, France, Norway, Poland, the Netherlands, and Greece. Canadian minesweepers played a crucial role clearing safe lanes through the English Channel. In the air, it's the same story. The Royal Air Force supplied 2/3 of the aircraft. For months leading up to D-Day, the RAF and the U.S. Army Air Forces systematically pounded French infrastructure, rail lines, bridges, and radar stations to cripple Germany's ability to respond. On the day itself, Allied air forces, including squadrons from Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Poland, had total supremacy over the battlefield. And of course, there were the ground troops. While American forces assaulted Utah and Omaha, the other three beaches, Gold, Sword, and Juno, were assigned to British and Canadian forces. Over 61,000 British troops landed on Gold and Sword beaches. On Sword, they were accompanied by Free French commandos fighting to liberate their homeland. The 14,000 Canadian soldiers who landed at Juno Beach had one of the toughest jobs of the day. They faced rough seas and more concentrated defenses than expected. But despite heavy casualties in the first hour, the Canadians broke through and pushed farther inland than any other Allied force on D-Day, a remarkable feat of arms. This was a force of a dozen nations united by a common goal. To remember it as anything less does a disservice to the thousands of non-American soldiers, sailors, and airmen who fought and died in Normandy. It's a small detail, but one that has spawned countless theories. What does the D in D-Day actually stand for? People have guessed decision, deliverance, doom, or departure. While some of those sound great, the real answer is far more mundane.
That's it. It's a placeholder military planners use to designate the day an operation is set to begin. Everything is timed in relation to this unspecified day. For example, D-5 is 5 days before the operation, and D+7 is 7 days after. The corresponding term for the time of the assault is H-hour, where the H just stands for hour. There had been hundreds of D-Days for other operations, but the sheer scale of Operation Overlord was so immense that the term became permanently associated with June 6, 1944. It became the D-Day. So, while it lacks poetic flair, the truth is a reminder that behind the grand narratives of history, there's a world of practical, unglamorous planning that makes it all possible. Of all the hidden truths about D-Day, nothing highlights the thin line between success and failure better than the story of the weather. The entire Normandy invasion, the culmination of years of planning, ultimately hinged on a single high-stakes weather forecast. The planners needed a full moon for the airborne troops and a low tide at dawn to expose the beach obstacles. These conditions only occurred on a few days in June, the 5th, 6th, and 7th. General Eisenhower had set the date for June 5th, but as the day approached, a massive storm was gathering in the Atlantic, promising gale-force winds and high seas. The man at the center of this crisis was a Scottish meteorologist, Group Captain James Stagg. It was his job to make the call under almost unimaginable pressure. In 1944, meteorology was an inexact science, relying on scattered reports to piece together a forecast. On the evening of June 3rd,
Stagg delivered the devastating news. The weather for June 5th would be a disaster. Reluctantly, Eisenhower made the gut-wrenching decision to postpone. The convoys, already at sea, were ordered to turn back. A further delay would mean waiting 2 more weeks, giving the Germans a massive window to discover the invasion plans. On the night of June 4th, amidst continuing storms, Stagg found a sliver of hope. His teams identified a brief 36-hour window of calmer weather that might open up on the morning of June 6th. It was far from perfect, but it was a chance. At a final briefing in the pre-dawn hours of June 5th, Stagg presented his forecast to a tense and exhausted Eisenhower. He couldn't promise good weather, only a brief respite. Eisenhower polled his commanders. They were divided. Finally, after a long silence, he made his decision. "Okay," he said, "let's go." It was perhaps the greatest gamble of the war, and it paid off. The German meteorologists, lacking the same weather data, had predicted the storms would continue for days. Convinced no invasion was possible, the German command stood down its patrols. Several senior commanders, including Rommel himself, were away from their posts. He'd gone home to Germany for his wife's birthday. Because of Stagg's courageous forecast, the largest invasion fleet in history achieved almost complete tactical surprise. The bad weather that nearly wrecked the operation ended up being one of the keys to its success. The story of D-Day that we've inherited is one of heroic simplicity, but the truth is infinitely more complex and compelling. The victory on June 6, 1944, wasn't just won by brute force. It was won in the quiet rooms of British intelligence, where a ghost army was born from lies. It was won by the quiet courage of a meteorologist who staked the fate of the world on his reading of the wind. And it was won through the blunders of a German high command paralyzed by indecision. Understanding the real casualty figures doesn't diminish the sacrifice. It honors those who fell by replacing myth with fact. Recognizing the immense contributions of the British, Canadians, and other allies doesn't lessen the American role. It elevates the story from a national triumph to a testament to international resolve. The story of D-Day isn't just about bravery on the beaches. It's a story of intelligence, deception, and chance that is far more fascinating than what we were taught in school. The official narrative gives us heroes. The full story gives us a lesson that history is never as simple as it seems. What are some other D-Day myths you've heard? Let us know in the comments below. And if you want to see more content that debunks the myths of history, make sure you're subscribed. Thanks for watching.